programmers, this is often their very first package they've ever used that's actually some external piece of code. You know, they start off reading a book about HTML and go, oh, you know, I'll build a website and I need a contact form and how do I send an email? Well, they do a search and they find PHP Mailer. And also, because of this sort of simple function and the fact that it's standalone, it gets used by lots of academic institutions all over the world. And so they give their students an assignment and they say, go and learn how to use a library and use PHP Mailer. Because it's easy to verify that it works, it does something that's simple and understandable, and so people can then concentrate on, you know, how to do things like use Composer. But this means that every time this happens, I get a whole flurry of questions on Stack Overflow, which all have exactly the same source code snippet in. Going like, how do I do this? It's like, you shouldn't be asking homework questions on here. PHP Mailer is ridiculously popular and has been for many, many years. We've got 7 million downloads on Packagist, 11,000 stars on GitHub, 6,500 forks. It's really kind of crazy. The graph in the background there shows the Google search trends. And I don't know if you can see, but every so often in there's a kind of a little dip. And those little dips correspond to Christmas each year. There's a little lull in the search for pretty much any kind of code during those times. And so if you can see across the years, there's these little dips. And then there's that big spike. Yes, well, you'll find out about that. So how did I end up in this situation of managing this? Well, PHP Mailer was not something that I started. I'm a maintainer of it. PHP Mailer started in 2001 on SourceForge. Started by a guy called Brent Matzel, and it's been through several sort of primary maintainers since then. But that kind of age, that's several thousand years old in code years. I first used it in 2003 because I was starting to build an email marketing system. And so this is really where my sort of continued interest in supporting something that's so deeply ingrained with email. And we're a significant user of it as well as being the maintainer. Now, back then I'd started using it and there were various bits and pieces where I'd fixed it and added features or whatever it was. And I became something of a significant contributor back at that time, though I was never the project owner then. Now, at that time, the project owner decided they'd had enough and they wanted to hand over control to somebody else. You have to bear in mind that back on SourceForge, this was the days of centralized source control. Now, SourceForge had at least switched from CVEs to Subversion, which was a big improvement. However, it still wasn't the distributed kind of stuff that we're used to today with Git. So who was in control of commit access and so on was a much bigger thing in the past, much more than it was now. Anyway, control of the project was then handed over to this other guy, and I was kind of a little bit put out by that because he hadn't really contributed anything prior to that point. I'm not quite sure how he managed to get into that situation. Anyway, so things moved on a bit, and eventually I heard about this new website which sounded really cool, and I really thought I should do something. So I forked the project of SourceForge onto this new site called GitHub. And GitHub was great. It was so much nicer to use than SourceForge. SourceForge was pretty bad back then, and it changed hands quite a few years ago. And they've added lots of features, but it's all kind of a bit haphazard and filled with ads. Certainly much less pleasant to use than GitHub. And I kept maintaining my fork on GitHub. Anytime stuff was posted on SourceForge, I'd merge the changes into my own fork. And when I did that, I maintained the entire commit history of everything that had happened in Subversion, converted it all into Git. Now, eventually, the guy who had taken over the project on SourceForge decided that he'd had enough as well, and he was having some health problems, and he wanted to pass on control to somebody else. And I was thinking, oh, great, cool, well, he might give it to me. And in fact, he didn't. He actually gave it to Apache, which I was quite surprised by. Apache runs and manages all kinds of open source projects, not just the Apache web server, but there are many other things that they do. And I thought, oh, this could be a really good move. We've got the resources of Apache that hopefully will be able to really take charge of this thing and throw some more developer resources at it. But as it turned out, it really didn't work like that. Apache moved it on to Google Code, which, as you may know, is where code goes to die. The first thing they did, which I thought, this isn't really on, is instead of taking the whole commit history from the version system on SourceForge, they just took a snapshot, a tarball of the current state of the code and chucked that on Google Code and said, that's it. I thought that's really not on for an open source project. The other thing is that they did none of their development in public. It was all completely hidden away in private. And every now and again, a new version would be kind of thrown over the wall, and this new tarball would appear. And there'd be no announcements or anything. I just happened to notice that it had appeared. And again, I really wasn't very happy about that. Now, they were actually fixing stuff, and there was a bug tracker on Google Code, and they were fixing stuff in there. But often, they wouldn't update the bug tracker. So you had to go and look at the release notes, at least they were updating release notes, and actually have a look at the changes in the code to find out whether they'd actually fixed stuff or not. So that was kind of annoying. And so what happened then is it started having this interaction with my own fork on GitHub, where every time they did one of these releases that was just this monolithic tarball with no version control attached to it at all, I then manually merged their changes into the whole development history on my GitHub fork. And then eventually I started taking a slightly more passive-aggressive approach, which was I'd look at their issue tracker and see bugs in it, and fix them in my own fork, and then report the changes back on their bug tracker. And eventually they kind of gave up and said, okay, you're doing a much better job of this than we are, so how about we just say, you take it over, and we'll point all the links at your site. So they pointed everything back at my ID on GitHub. Now, at that point, it was kind of, well, I don't really want such a huge project just under my own personal area on GitHub. So I started the PHP mailer organization and moved the project into that. And then, despite putting loads of signs all over my fork of it saying, this is my personal fork, don't fork this, don't touch this version, I still have like 5,000 stars on my own personal fork. Anyway, so that was back in 2013, and since then, that's where it's gained its 11,000 stars. So Google Code eventually died in 2016, presumably because it hosted itself, and so we're left. We're left where we are now, that the SourceForge project is still there with lots of signs all over it, and it still gets like 10,000 downloads a day of code that's nearly getting on for 10 years old. It's crazy. Anyway, so going back to this coordinated disclosure. The way this is meant to work, it used to be called responsible disclosure, but they decided that was a little bit judgmental, and so calling it coordinated is a little more even. So the idea is that someone finds a vulnerability in a system, a piece of code, whatever. They report it to the vendor or maintainer. The vendor then develops a mitigation patch, whatever it is they need to fix it. They release the patch, and then the vulnerability is publicly disclosed. However, things often don't work out this way. One really common thing to happen is that someone finds the vulnerability and follows this path. But meanwhile, somebody else finds exactly the same vulnerability and takes a rather different path and chooses perhaps to try and exploit it for their own benefit, for example, or sell it to somebody. So there are lots of ways this can go wrong. Another common problem is vendors either not responding to reports of security holes, or being in complete denial and going, no, our code's lovely, there's nothing wrong with it. And that happens a lot as well. So when this happens, if the vulnerability gets disclosed prior to either the vendor doing anything about it or there at least being a patch released, this is called a zero-day. And zero-day vulnerabilities and exploits for them are really a valuable commodity in the kind of the black hat hacker world and that of security agencies. So whether you get a problem that's public or not, these things get numbered. And these things are called CVE numbers, and CVE stands for the common vulnerabilities and exposures. And the idea here is that it provides a single reference point for any particular vulnerability, whether it's a hardware device, whether it's a software library, an application, whatever it is. this number is the handle that is forever attached to that individual problem. And each different problem, there may be sort of sub-numbers. Sometimes you get a big complicated vulnerability which actually ends up with a whole bunch of different CVE numbers. So this common reference means that people can find it easily. And CVE system is run by a company called the MITRE Corporation, which is funded by the US government Department of Homeland Security. And you can go to their website and look at that, and also search the bug database or the vulnerability database at the NIST site as well. So PHP Mailer got 2 CVE numbers. Now, 2016, I think, was the first year they'd had to actually spread into 5 digits for the count of the of CVE numbers. So we got 10,033, closely followed by 10,045. So why 2 numbers? Well, we'll see. Right. The number itself doesn't tell you anything. You know, you could almost have a CVE number for a typo. If that typo is potentially lethal, then that could be a problem. But you need some other information other than the number. The number itself says nothing. So the type and severity is part of a CVE report. So if you follow one of those reports on the CVE site, you'll find out all about it. And the first thing you need to know really is what kind of vulnerability is this? And there are some common types. And really the top of the pile in terms of vulnerabilities is called remote code execution. And this is where somebody can submit a piece of code into your device, system, whatever, and have that be run in a context which you were perhaps not expecting code supplied by a user to be able to rerun. Now the impact of those things can vary. And then other kinds of attacks, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, denial of service. There are lots of other different ones as well. And that uses the CVEs numeric scoring system, which is the common vulnerability scoring system. Amazing. And that's just a number between 0 and 10. And then it also gets a descriptive term, which is critical, high, medium, or low. And PHP Mailer's 2 CVE numbers were rated 9.8 critical. A little, this is not good. So let's have a little dive into what the actual problem was. So here's some actual code. So this is a very basic example of how to send a message using PHP Mailer. You create an instance of the class, you set a subject, set who it's from, set who it's going to, set the message body, tell it to send. By default, it sends using PHP's mail function, which is actually the core of the problem here. Now, the issue at the center of this thing is probably something you could guess where the source of the problem is. It's this line here, where we're taking input from the user and passing it into the setFrom function. So we're expecting this email field in a form to contain an email address that's used then as the from address. Now, when you send, well, the documentation tells you not to do this, because if you're accepting a user input as the from address, you're expecting the person to put in their own email address, not your email address. So it means that if you say that you're sending it from their address, that's effectively forgery. And that will result in your message probably being bounced or spam filtered because it will fail SPF checks. So the documentation does say, and all the examples say, don't do it this way, but people do it anyway. So what happens inside PHP Mailer is there's an additional address. There's the to address, the from address, but there's actually another one which is kind of hidden behind the scenes to some extent and you may not necessarily be aware of. When you send a message over SMTP, there are various commands that get executed on the SMTP server. And one of the commands is mail from. And usually, the address that's submitted there is the same as the from address that's actually within the headers of the message. But it doesn't have to be. And it's actually quite common to want to control that address separately. For example, you might want to set your bounce handler script and embed additional data into the address that it's sent to. And that's something called VERP addressing and is commonly supported in mail servers. And generally speaking, that address is not really visible to the recipient, the end user. And when that address is received, or the receiving end of the mail conversation, the receiving mail server takes that address that was used in the SMTP mail from command, and it adds it to the top of the message as a return path header. So the return path header is not something that you add as a sender, it's something that gets added on by the receiver. Now, because most of the time you're not really bothered about this, that PHP Mailer's default action is that it takes whatever you set as the from address and uses that as the SMTP envelope sender, as it's called. So I can see anybody who knows anything about security here should say, well, the obvious thing to do here is that you want to filter and validate this user input before you use it. Well, we do. We do exactly that, and it doesn't help. So why might that be? Well, there's something quite scary about this. How data behaves varies according to its context. It's quite heavily dependent. So for example, an SQL injection string will probably have no significant effect if you try and execute it as a shell command. It will just do nothing. Because in that context, it's just rubbish. It doesn't mean anything to the shell. Similarly, an email address is an email address. If it's used in an email context, it's harmless. But in this case, a valid working attack string can also be a valid email address. That's something that we hadn't really thought of. And it's reasonably subtle, but we'll get to this. So what happens inside, and this is the actual bug that's within the 10,033 thing, is we do this. The mail function in PHP has a final parameter called additional parameters, and that's where you can just tack in extra stuff that gets passed in to the shell command that's used by mail. In fact, the mail function opens a shell command, opens a shell, and issues a call to your local send mail binary, and it can just tack on some additional parameters if you have any. So you can see here that what we do is we pass in the sender, which is ultimately set from the from address, unless you've overridden it. So that's what we're doing. Now, because the attack string can be a valid email address, that sender value is passed on to a command line. So we've got an email address being passed on to a command line via a shell. So the thing we need to do there is escape it, right? So we do this. We apply the escape shellog function just to exactly the same thing, and that's it. That's the fix. So this is what I mentioned right back at earlier on. A lot of these, a lot of security vulnerabilities are actually really tiny things. They can be very small, but have very significant effects. So this is the thing we were looking at the time, and just about this time, somebody posted an exploit in public before we had actually been able to test this or release it. So we had become a zero-day vulnerability at that point, but at least we'd had some notice up front. But what actually happened is that the security researcher that had found this problem had mentioned that he'd found a problem, and somebody on this mailing list had said, "Is it this one?" and posted an example exploit. It's like, Anyway, so this was all out in public now. This was all quite stressful. So that was rushed out as PHP Mailer 5.2.18, which is also known as CVE 2016-10045. So the same researcher, unfortunately, had noticed that we'd actually introduced a different vulnerability. So it's got another CVE number. It's like a big game of whack-a-mole. You break the one thing, you make a new problem. So what happened now? Given that all we did was that one tiny change, what's so wrong? Well, it's because we think we're doing this. There's the mail command that the PHP mail function assembles, and then we're tacking on our escaped additional parameters onto the end of it. However, the mail function actually applies escape shell command to the whole thing. And that means that we're actually doing this. So we're applying the escape shell command function to the entire string, including the escape shell command, escape shell arg inside that, which means that that string is getting escaped twice. And the result of that is undefined and exploitable. That's kind of scary. So we released a workaround for that in PHP Mailer 5.2.20. But fundamentally, this is actually a PHP bug. It's not really a bug in PHP Mailer at all. Now, if you actually read the mail function documentation carefully, you'll find that it does actually contain a vague warning about this. And it's something really to be avoided. So what we did in the fix for this is that we actually we just introduced some severe restrictions on what was allowed to go in the sender address. And essentially what we do is we apply escaping to the shell, to the address that's passed in as the sender. And if it's different from the address, i.e. if it needed any escaping at all, we just don't use it. The idea there is that if it needs escaping, there's probably something iffy, because the vast majority of email addresses don't need escaping. So if it needs escaping, there's probably something dodgy going on, and we'll just avoid it. If you don't use it, all that happens is that PHP just falls back to using its defaults. So if you haven't set up anything, you'll probably end up with, PHP fpm at localhost.local domain as the sender address, which is harmless. So throughout all of this process, I wasn't dealing with this by myself, even though I'm the maintainer. It doesn't necessarily mean I do everything, fortunately. Really, the security researcher who found all this was very helpful, and he helped review and verify some of the mitigations. Although, again, having the public exploit posted really explained why we ended up with the second CVE number. And other researchers turned up to help. Now, this is a really common thing in any kind of security event. As soon as somebody finds a problem and news about it leaks out or is announced one way or another, other researchers are really interested in what's going on, because they want to learn from it, and because they're obviously trying to establish their own credentials as security researchers in their own right, they're often looking for clues that they can use to search for similar vulnerabilities in other contexts. So this bunch of people were not the usual contributors to PHP Mailer. You get a few regulars in any open source project, but these were not the usual ones. In amongst all this, there was really quite a lot of press coverage. It was a big deal. This affected millions or tens of millions of websites. So because it's used in WordPress, Joomla, Drupal, and loads of other systems use this. And a zillion contact forms that are poorly implemented is actually probably the primary place where this was actually a real problem. It got lots of articles in the press, Security Week, the Register. I was particularly pleased to get a mention in the SANS newsletter. It's one of my favorites. And it was often actually misreported as an input validation error. As we've seen, this wasn't to do with input validation. It was to do with shell escaping. So that was kind of slightly annoying. There was a certain amount of the usual PHP abuse going, oh, you should use a proper language. But generally speaking, the comments that we got on how the vulnerability and the mitigation of it had been handled were generally positive. And the thing about all of this is that, this happened just before Christmas. And I think we actually got that 5.2.20 release for the second thing out actually on Christmas Eve. And I was off with my family and trying to have a family Christmas, and there was all this major stress going on. So I was just really pleased to have got this out. And I was then kind of bracing myself for the onslaught of abuse. However, there wasn't any. I got no personal abuse whatsoever, which I was actually really surprised by, because I'd seen other situations where people had been kind of harangued and abused for really quite small problems. So I was expecting to get it in the neck, but in fact it just didn't happen. But the other thing which I was actually surprised by was that there was no media contact at all. All of these websites posted news articles about it, but none of them actually contacted the project itself. It's like, surely this is journalism 101, just ask people and they say stuff and you can write it down. It's like your article writes itself almost. But anyway, the other thing is that the 0-day window that we'd had was really pretty short. We got the change out within probably half a day. So that was a good thing. And because of that, it hadn't had much impact. WordPress were pushed to do a release. So they released a major sort of security alert thing, and quite a few things like Drupal plugins got similar treatment. So after all that had happened, I was then kind of looking back on like how this had gone and how I felt about it, and it had all been really quite emotional. But the one thing I was then thinking about was like, well, this is actually quite a subtle problem. So I wondered, how had other PHP email libraries fixed this? And so I went and had a look, and they hadn't. Now, one of the things that had happened, my interactions with the security researcher, was that there were periods where he was quite slow to respond to email and things like that. And I was thinking, like, this is really pretty urgent. It's like, what's going on here? So I then found out that he was actually busy going through exactly the same process with all these other people, because he'd done exactly the thing that security researchers do, which is looking for the same problem in other contexts. So Zendmail, SwiftMailer, Roundcube all had this problem. Now, Roundcube had actually got onto this a little bit earlier, and they'd done a very simple fix, which would actually break some things, but would actually render it safe. The route we went meant that we wouldn't break anything, and it was also safe, but it was a slightly more complicated fix than Roundcube had done. Zendmail ended up doing something similar to that. SwiftMailer hadn't done anything at all, and they actually ended up just simply taking the function we'd used and just literally copying and pasting it into SwiftMailer, because it's open source, is what it's for. Not only that, there were actually similar bugs in Python, Ruby, and Node.js libraries, because they all do the same thing. They often, instead of using SMTP, they want to pass stuff to a local sendmail binary, which is generally worth avoiding anyway. After all of this had kind of calmed down a bit, the researcher then wrote a long article about the general vulnerability of PHP's mail function. In fact, it's not actually just the mail function, it's actually the escaping functions in general. On the whole, if you can, avoid using shell functions at all. If you need to talk to another process, do it directly using things like popen or open local connections using SMTP. It's actually faster to do that as well. So, the lessons I learned from this, really, don't use mail. Not only is using mail relatively dangerous, it's got this potential problem, it is actually slower and less predictable than using SMTP to localhost. Because what happens when you actually call a sendmail binary through a shell, what happens is the sendmail binary simply opens a synchronous connection to localhost and talks SMTP over it and has its conversation, then when it's finished it returns. So in fact, though that you might think that calling this local binary is going to be really fast, in fact it's not actually doing anything that you couldn't do faster yourself. And so the best way to send stuff is actually via a local host SMTP connection anyway. And if you go and look at the postfix documentation on performance, you'll find that that's exactly what they suggest, that you should use SMTP to localhost. Coincidentally, one of the first talks I ever did was back in about 2006, and it was called Staying Away from Mail. I was doing it purely for the performance reasons. I wasn't aware that there were these security holes in it. But it was kind of coincidental that I'd suggested that people stay away from it anyway. If they had, then they wouldn't be vulnerable, so that was good. The other thing I learned overall is that open source is just awesome. The entire kind of infrastructure, the whole existence of GitHub, the fact that we have packages like this, the way that you can use them, the way that people do collaborate on them, is just amazing. When it really matters, people will turn up and help. So it's not all left up to you as a maintainer. And that was quite heartening, because when this stuff started happening, I was kind of, oh, what am I going to do, kind of thing. And I was really quite worried about it. The other thing which really drove home to me was that security researchers need, and whistleblowers, they need legislative protection. But we've seen the sort of bad way that many whistleblowers have been treated by companies and governments, and they really need protection. But overall, it's just great that the existence of packages like PHP Mailer has just made it so much easier for millions of websites to do something as simple as sending an email. But it's only a tiny little piece of the entire world of open source, and all of these things interact. And all of that open source stuff really makes it possible for this industry that we're all in to exist at all. So if you're going to deal with all this kind of rubbish, and it's not exactly a day job, why be a maintainer? Why put yourself in this position? Well, there's certainly a sense of sort of professional pride in doing a job well without having a client breathing down your neck over it. But it's often really quite a drag to deal with a zillion reports from those people that don't even get around to reading the README. or doing things like that. So they open a new issue on GitHub, and the very first thing they do is select all on that template in the issue tracker and delete it all and just paste in their source code. Whereas if they actually read what it said, they probably wouldn't even have to continue with the opening of the issue. But every now and again, you get something nice happen. Now, this was an email I got out of the blue. The broken light bulb thing that it refers to was that somebody had suggested a fix for a problem, for an SMTP problem, which amounted to not using SMTP. And the broken light bulb thing was, I was saying that it was like saying that a broken light bulb only doesn't work when it's turned on. He liked that, or whatever. And it's not really kind of ego stroking, it's just a little recognition every now and again. It's really quite nice to receive. And it helps to keep up enthusiasm. So if there are open source projects that you use, every now and again just say like, hey, thanks dude, that's a really great library, it really solved my problem, and you know, I love it, whatever. The other thing which was especially nice about this message is that this was not in response to me having fixed something for him. This was just out of the blue. He'd just been reading stuff and sent me this message. So that was really nice. So if you can do this for somebody, do it. It'll make their day. They'll feel better about it. The other thing that really helps is you need a certain cynicism to carry on doing this stuff because you know that you're going to get a torrent of GitHub issues being opened, of Stack Overflow questions that are going to be exact repeats that have been posted many times, that there are hundreds of known solutions for, but people are just not really after doing that. They kind of want an easy way. And essentially, they want somebody that's going to type the same thing as the documentation says back at them. So why don't you just read the documentation instead of me copying and pasting it into this answer? But yeah, so I sometimes find that I do act a little harshly towards some people on Stack Overflow and on GitHub, especially when they've done something very obvious. Well, one of the things that I did a few years back, which I think helped, is that I made it that whenever you get you can turn on debug output in PHP Mailer, and that gives you things like the whole SMTP conversation. And that's usually a really good way of diagnosing the problem, what it is that's going on. But one of the things that I did is I made it that if you had debug mode turned on and you had debug output, the thing you get right at the end of it is a link to a troubleshooting guide. And that contains fixes for probably a good 90% of all the problems that people typically run into. It's usually caused by things like Google changed the certificate that Gmail used to one that was signed by a CA that wasn't in a lot of Linux bundles. So there were lots of people running operating systems that hadn't been updated, and they had out-of-date CA bundles, which meant that they were getting SSL certificate verification failures when they tried to send stuff through Gmail. I've answered that question like 200 times. It's crazy. So that's exactly one of the things which is covered in immense detail in the troubleshooting guide. Something that comes up quite a bit in open source is the subject of donations. You know, this is stuff that's done by volunteers on the whole, and there are major projects that get backing and sponsorship and so on. But really, there's a lot of time, effort, and enthusiasm that goes onto it. Obviously, I've stuck with this because I'm using PHP Mailer myself on an everyday basis in our email marketing system. So I have a vested interest in it staying working and continuing to work efficiently and reliably and safely and so on. There's a lot of stuff that's outside the code itself. So there's say, answering questions on Stack Overflow, bug triage, pointing people at documentation from GitHub issues, writing documentation, writing GitHub wiki articles, telling other people to write GitHub wiki articles. It just kind of goes on and on. But on the subject of donations, I think it's important to distinguish between the project itself and the people involved with it. So if you look at the project itself, what about it would actually benefit from sponsorship? For PHP Mailer, the only thing I could really think of would be perhaps a code audit, to get a bunch of code auditors who do this every day to actually like pick apart every last little detail and find problems like this proactively. Now that kind of treatment is expensive, and somebody perhaps could sponsor that one day. So that's something that's very much for the project itself, is actual project sponsorship. But that's nothing to do with the time and effort that people put in. There are other things that you might want, perhaps translations. But for PHP Mailer, certainly, translations is one of the things that I receive a lot of. PHP Mailer has its error messages in over 50 languages now. And one of the things that very often happens, that I'll get these first-time contributor things flagged on GitHub, where it's somebody that's just doing like literally a slight rewording of one of the error messages in some language that I cannot read. Some of them are really pretty. Things like Georgian and Hindi, they're just lovely to look at. I have no idea what they say, but they're very pretty. The other thing is how people actually give you donations. Well, the most obvious ones really are PayPal and Patreon. Now, Patreon is brilliant for writers in particular. If you're a blogger, a regular blogger and seeking to get income from what you're blogging about, Patreon is absolutely for you. It's brilliant. Whereas for something like PHP Mailer, effectively you end up having to become a blogger in order to benefit from it, because you effectively get paid for writing blog articles, which is just distraction from the primary task of doing all the other things that we've seen on this list. So a more straightforward way is PayPal. PayPal has these donation buttons. And it's important that you make it easy. So I have a little story of donations here. I got somebody open another GitHub issue saying, I'd like to make a donation to PHP Mailer or to you, and there's no information anywhere on the site, in the project, of how to actually do that. So I thought about this, and it's like, yeah, he's right. There's not really anything. So what do I need to do? So I had a few emails backwards and forwards with him, and he was saying, well, I've just started this new job, and because I'm in this sort of position, and the company and all their projects are really heavily dependent on open source. And this stuff has saved us tens of thousands of dollars, thousands of man-hours of work. And he really wants to be able to give back. So he was trying at his new job to try and instill this ethic of giving back to open source in the form of monetary contributions to the people behind it. So I thought, that sounds great. That's a really nice outlook, and it's really good that he's trying to push this into an environment which is clearly kind of corporate sounding. So he said, yeah, the only problem is that, this all has to be kind of done by the book, and it's got to be done by the accounts department. So the best thing to do is really do it via PayPal, because when PayPal handles the donations, they class everything correctly with the tax codes and the way it's referred to and the actual amounts and calculations and stuff. So it's all done properly. So I went and had a look into PayPal donation buttons. So first of all, I have a PayPal account. And it turns out that you can't use donation buttons with personal accounts. You have to convert them to a business account. So I converted my account to a business account, which is free, to be fair. And then I was able to make a button. So I have this little snippet of HTML. It's like, OK, so where do I put this? My first thought was, obviously, I want to put it on, say, my GitHub profile page. So I look on the GitHub profile page, and you've got a little space for a description, and you can have one link. And that's it. And you're limited to like 300 characters or something. It's very small. So that really wasn't going to work. So what I did is I've got a blog which I hardly use, but I just made a page on that, and I put the button on there, and then I made a link to it from my GitHub profile page. So that was cool. So having got all that sorted out, he said, I told him that I'd done that, and he goes, OK, great, I'll get something to you next week. It's like, oh, that's very nice. So then eventually, yes, I get an email. Yes, he donated 25 cents. Now, it's very nice that he actually donated anything at all. It wasn't something that I'd asked for. He did volunteer it. However, to go through all that for 25 cents, it's not a really good rate. Now, since then, I've actually received 2 other donations. One of 75 cents. That's a 300% improvement. And then I gave this talk at PHP de Benelux earlier this year, and somebody felt sorry for me after that. So they donated €9 to take me to a nice round 10, which allowed me to buy a couple of the virtual beers that many people had offered to buy me. So donations. I'm not really quite sure how other projects handle it, but this was just my experience of it. And it's not, people don't do open source for the money, really. They do it. They use open source for the money, but it's not the actual maintenance of it. So it's nice. If people want to make a donation, that's great, but I'm not really out for the donations. So all of this leads me to really talk about people that need thanking for this stuff. Certainly from my experience that we've just been covering here, security researchers, we need them. They do a really important thing. It's far better that a security researcher finds a hole in your project and tells you about it than some bad guy does. So we want those people to do this stuff and to carry on doing it. So I support everything they do. It also helps I do a bit of this kind of stuff myself. Anybody who comments and submits pull requests in particular and reviews code, these are high value people in open source projects, even if they're not writing stuff themselves necessarily, but helping you to get the best out of things that other people have done. Down at a kind of more basic level, anybody who provides positive feedback and functional, usable bug reports, rather than saying like, it doesn't work, which is usually what happens on Stack Overflow. And speaking of which, to those people that actually answer questions on Stack Overflow, I think I've answered about 500 or 600 questions on PHP Mailer on Stack Overflow. And I'd say probably at least half of them are the same. But really, it's thank you to every open source project, because none of us would be in work doing the stuff we're doing without it. So the very thing that this conference is about, PHP itself is open source. The web server you run it on is open source. Chances are the server that you're deploying it on is running an open source operating system. It's just kind of unending. None of this industry would really exist without all these amazing resources. But really, all of those projects are down to people like us that actually write code and deploy it and get it out there. So you really have to say thank you to you for your own projects and for listening today.
Thank you so much, Marcus. And let me add one word, because maybe you also got the information. I think this was last month when Linus Torvalds, as the maintainer of the Linux kernels, resigned from his job. He excused even to the community because he seems not to be such a friendly guy like you are. And yeah, I really want to also emphasize, let's say, the social aspect of all of that, because I read a study. There was a data scientist. She analyzed 4,000 emails from Linus Torvalds. No, she analyzed 21,000 emails from Linus of the last 4 years, and she found out that in 1,000 or more than 1,000 emails, he used the word slut, bitch, crap, and bastard, or a combination of all of those. So he did a great job on the one hand, technically, of course, but on the other hand, this really creates such an exclusive atmosphere. I deeply believe that many talents out there would say, I don't want to work in such an atmosphere. And I really believe that, for example, the environment you are creating is really a friendly one, and looking to that email, I think it's also a really great aspect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now, tomorrow there's some workshops. This afternoon there's still some sessions. This is the last opportunity where we all meet here in the big hall. On behalf of SNS Media, the organizer of this conference, I'd like to say thank you to you all for joining here. And of course, I'd also like all of you give a huge and very loud applause to all of our speakers. Yeah, they really did a great job, I think. Thank you so much for being here. And of course, many other people helped to setting up this conference. Our department marketing, Orga, the editorial team, the technical guys, the hotel folks. Maybe I forgot somebody, but many people also in the back really helped to have that you all guys have a good time right here at the conference. I hope you like it, and I hope you give us many feedbacks so that we can inform our speakers, of course, how you liked it and what they maybe can improve in this and that detail, etc. Enjoy the afternoon. Have safe travels home. Thank you. you liked it and what they maybe can improve in this and that detail, etc.